Now for the assembly of the backpack. First we want to assemble the outer zip panel. And this has got a zip pocket in it, but it also turns itself, and the panel turns itself into a pocket as well. So we want to actually continue our quilting through our center panel, and we want to pin our corner points so we have a solid start and stop point for when we're actually sewing the seam. We're going to be sewing just inside the stitching, perimeter stitching line, making sure that our quilting design follows through when it's turned to the right side. Okay, let's go to the machine. So we can start within the seam allowance because it's easier. It doesn't have to be right to the very end. And stitch so as we've got seam on top of seam, and we are going to be stitching just onto the left hand side of the perimeter stitching line. Just check to see that our Van Dykes of our quilting match up. This seam is not quite so important because we have the zip to interrupt the pattern, but again we need to make sure that our center panel matches as we sew it through. Stitching on the left hand side of the perimeter stitching line from edge to edge. Right, there we go. Now we're going to be making both the front and the back panels. Now they are identical. We've made ours out of cork. They have 3 sections, top, middle and bottom. And we're going to actually join these together, just like we did with the previous panel. Corner on corner, line on top of line, stitching to the left-hand side of the perimeter stitching line. Now these do have a Van Dyke quilting pattern, which is a triple stitch, and they will be in sequence when you actually turn them to the right side. We want those lines to continue through the seam as well as possible. Okay. Now we'll add the other panel to the other end. Again, stitching point on point, left hand side of the perimeter stitching line, matching the seams or the stitching lines as we go. There we go. Now we need to press these seams open. So let's go to the pressing board. Let's start with our outer zipper panel first. Press that seam open, lots of steam. Oops, arm in the way, thank you. Press that seam open, again lots of steam. And then just do a dry press from the front, sitting nice and flat, ideal. Now with the cork, because it's cork, we can't put the iron directly onto it. So let's just put a pressing cloth, which is just a piece of calico, or cotton casement, press the seam open, and then dry it off from the right side. Again, press the seam open, and using steam, and dry it off from the right side. There we go, 1 panel, 2 panels, plus the outer zip panel. Now let's look at our strap. Now the shoulder strap, we want to actually just trim just outside the perimeter stitching line. Now we got you to just trim roughly around the edge with a 1/4 inch seam. Now we want to true it up and make sure that we trim just on the outside of those perimeter stitches. Now our binding will be either a 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch binding. That goes around the outside edge and around the curve, not at the top square, but from the long side around the curve and up to the other side. We use the self fabric binding, it's store-bought, and we're just going to clip this into position with some quilt clips. Now you can open the binding up and stitch on the first crease line all the way around the edge to get it to sit properly if you wish to. I think the notes will show you that. This is just showing you how this is going to sit. To get that curve to sit nicely, you can actually go to the iron and lightly steam it. Be very aware, well, I have to be very aware with this, but I am using cork, so I'd be pressing from the underside to make sure I don't attach the cork. Although we have a strap going through this cloth tunnel, we're not going to see that curve at all actually once the product is made. Now we have a second option. We can use some knit binding. So knit binding is stretchy. and it's got a self-made fold crease line in it, and it goes on very, very easy. Now, I've bound the inside seams of this cross body pack with knit binding. Make sure you have a decent width and a decent length. It doesn't have to be tight as far as the zigzag goes. And we're using a zigzag just to encompass the edge of the knit binding. It does not matter. Using a zigzag means that you actually have more likelihood of catching both top and bottom. And for this casual approach, let's go back a few stitches and lift that foot so there's no pleat there. For this casual approach there, a zigzag binding is quite acceptable. The industry does it. If you are a stalwart for finish, by all means, tack it into place, maybe even baste it into place and use a straight stitch. It is up to you. It is not going to be a big deal if you use a zigzag on this binding. See how easy that was? Using a walking foot, which makes things life a little bit easier as well. So with the cloth one, we're doing the same sort of thing. Excuse my pics, I need to take some photos for our notes. And it saves me making 2 samples. As we come around the edge, yeah, I'm just fingering those corners in. I think I like the cloth binding more than there, but it really doesn't matter. Now we need to make the outside continuous gusset. So there's actually a long strip which is joined in all seams, and it has the D-rings on the base panel at either end. So those D-rings just want to be stitched inside the seam allowance. We're going to be making a continuous loop, but we need to get these features on first. So I'm just stitching just on the right hand side of the seam allowance. It's just going to actually base those into place by machine. So that's the base panel. We need to add that onto our next panel as well. But really, before we do that, we need to actually cut our lining. So I am sewing that together, but really we need to stop here and actually cut our lining, which is our next segment. So let's have a look at that. If you wanted to, you could actually join this seam on both ends actually and cut out a continuous strip of lining without those seams in it. Yeah, it's up to you. It depends on how much fabric you've got. So here's me. I'm going to actually cut our linings out now. So I've got our back and front, and then we've got also the front zip pocket panel. I've just got a fat quarter here, and I'm going to be able to get almost my 3 bigger pieces of lining out of this. I'm going to cut a pair for my back and front. And then I'm going to actually add some extra fabric to the bottom of the remaining piece of lining and cut my odd-shaped front zip panel out of the rest, just so as that the lining matches. Once down inside the pocket on the outer side panel, then you will not see if there's actually a fabric join, so don't be too panicked about it. So there we have a pair for the front and back. Love this fabric. Love the tulip fabric. It's absolutely beautiful. Okay, now I have just folded and marked our center points on those 4 pieces. Now you can see I've used the remaining piece of lining and just added a bit of that plain pocketing at the bottom, just so as I can use that same pattern. And we need to have a pair of side gussets and a base piece, or you could do it in a continuous length. It's up to you. Let's attach our lining to one of the fronts or backs. Just pin. So 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, 2 on one of the sides. Sorry, I mean 2 pins on the bottom, 2 pins on the top, and then 1 on each side. And we want to stitch that just on the original stitching line with a long stitch to actually machine base these 2 layers together. So it is wrong sides together. Because we're going to be sewing this together and then binding the inside seams of this bag, it's not quite so important to we're not going to be making a bagged out lining or anything. We're just going to be binding the finished seams. A very commercial finish, simple finish. Don't be scared of binding. It's not a big issue. No one is going to see it. Okay, so that's that attach. We want to do that for the pair. Then for one of them, we want to put a mesh. Well, I've put a mesh pocket on one of them, so it's the back piece of the panel. Just got a piece of mesh, and the mesh pocket is just over half the length of the of that back section. You don't want it too shallow. You don't want it too deep. I'm just machine stitching it to the fold of this knit binding. Then I'm just going to turn this over and zigzag it down. That's the top edge of this mesh pocket. It's a hard edge rather than just having a folded over mesh edge, which is messy, and it's also it's probably harder to find if you've got your hand inside your pack and looking for the pocket. So that's just very simple, and we're going to place this on so as it's evenly positioned. Pin it into place, and again machine baste it into position with a little bit longer stitch than you'd normally sew with. The mesh has a tendency to creep slightly, so don't be too startled if you find you turn the work over and find that it's got a little pleat or it's pushed out of place. It's just that when you turn curves like this, when stitching, sometimes mesh will actually creep and walk. And I think that I did have to unpick a section of this and just re-sew it because it had moved, just slightly on that bottom right corner, but it really does not matter as long as it's secure. Let's join our pieces of our base and our side gusset sections. 1/2 inch seam. Just finger press those open. And then join the other one. And you know which seams are going to join because they're different lengths. The top of the side gusset in there is narrower than the base of the side gusset. So there's only one way of joining them. Again, open that. I'll just finger press that open rather than going to the iron. And then we want to actually put our top zipper panel and attach it to the top of the side gusset. Again, just sewing inside the perimeter stitching line of that panel. Now I have edge stitched that down, but that's optional and you can do it at the end. Actually, I actually ended up undoing that edge stitching because I thought that was a bit previous. We want to then attach our lining, and we do that by sandwiching our zip and our panel in between, our zip panel in between our side gusset and our piece of lining. We just sandwich it on that top seam, and then when it's turned through to the right side, it will be all nicely and neatly enclosed, and we will machine base both sides of this lining to the outside gusset section. It creates a loop, it creates a circle, and we're just going to then keep our edges even, and with a long stitch just stitch through all those layers to create a single piece of gusset, which will attach to the back or front of panels, those cork panels, and then we will bind the seam inside the pack when we complete. Just stitch up there and across and then come down. If you've got any overhang for any reason, just trim it up. Well, on an overhang of lining, that is. But it should be even because you used the outside panel piece as a pattern, so it should be even. A little bit longer stitch when you're doing this, but not much. So now we have a continuous loop and we have a zip opening in the top, which we'll be able to get into the pack. I don't think the opening is too small. There has been discussion on that. I think it's fine. Right, we want to actually sew these two curved seams, because the top of these two curved seams is where the actual webbing strap is going to come out of. So let's pin those into position on both sides, keeping the sides even, keeping the top even. This is a bias cut seam, so be careful not to stretch it. You don't want it stretched. And again, so just inside the perimeter stitching line, I started from the edge of the work rather than inside the seam allowance. Keep it nice and fluid, let it flow. Right, I'm just going to reach up and pull this through to show you what we've just done, to give you an idea. So that top section at the top there is still open while I'm tucking through. So that gives you an idea. That's the shape that we're going to end up with. We need to turn it back to the outside because we need to trim it up and then clip into the seam. So we'll turn it back into the inside. Trim those seams up to 1/4 of an inch. Just the curved seams we've sewn, not the top. Clip, 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 clip every 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch around our curve. Clip, clip, clip. Right, so we're ready to turn this through, but before we do that, we need to add our strap. Now, we're very, very lucky we actually do have a piece of tulle webbing for our strap, which is just so nice because it works so beautifully with this design. So that's where it's going to lay, so we need to thread it up inside and let it poke out by about 3/8 to a centimetre at the top. And then we want to stitch across the top of the seam, but stitch 2 or 3 times because that's going to hold holding the strength of the whole pack. That little seam, that's holding the weight of the pack. So make sure it's secure. Take that and give that a press once we're done, and then we want to just round that bottom circular area around the bottom there. We just want to machine base all those layers together again. So after doing that, we need to find our center mark. Okay, fold in half, find our center, match to the center of the bottom one, which we've already found, and just going to quickly show you, I'm going to pin those 2 sides there so as to show you that it actually does have some fullness in this pocket. Doesn't sit flat. It's got a little bit of fullness it's got an inch of fullness actually. Just so as it sits proud from that back panel behind it, and easier for us to access, easy to add a bottle of water or something that's a little bit bulky that we need to grab out during our use of this pack. So just resituate those pins so as that we've got curve on curve, because we have got a little of extra fullness across the top of that panel. Our curves will be a slightly different shape. They will sew together perfectly and you'll never notice the difference, but you need to pin them into place so as they're easier to sew together. We're going to be again sewing the seam around the outside edge to machine baste it together. If you have any overhang of lining or anything, just trim it off. So now let's go back to our machine. We are machine basting the design together. All those panels, they will be a bit thick, but they need to be. You don't want a frail bag when traveling. You want something quite secure. You want your goods to be secure. You want to know that things are going to stay inside the pack. if you find that your sewing foot is just not performing nicely for you, then put on a zip foot. You'll be able to actually sit on top of the lines quite easily with a zip foot. Right, so there is our finished front panel. So let's go to our work area, and so there we have it. Now we want to just check everything is working. Let's fold our strap up and tuck it inside that pocket we've just made. Right. Now, zip at the top. And that's going to be sewn together. Those seams will be sewn on the inside. So let's just find our bottom center notch on our base panel and our joined pocket panels. And again, our center on center. We know how to do this. We just fold the work in half, and then we find the notch. And then we want to clip around our curve every couple of centimeters, just around the curved area. Well, just around the area that this seam, this gusset is going to sew to the curve. Let's just use our quilt clips and actually sew that, pin those all together. Now it sits very flat. It actually, if you've taken the right seams, it sits perfectly. I'm using the normal J foot on this machine, which is the normal straight stitching foot. By all means, if you're finding it a struggle, put your zip foot on. Ideally, we're wanting our seams to be sitting on top of each other so as there's no seams showing when we turn the work through. If you find that you're not stitching straight or it's a little bit wobbly, then stitch around the area, the perimeter area seam like we're doing now. Stitch it around again once it's all together. There's nothing wrong with doing that. The last thing you want is any pleats, that's the thing. So turn it through and just check that you haven't got any pleats. Turn it through and check that we haven't got any outside stitching showing. If you have, you need to go in and restitch that seam. Don't unpick it, just restitch it. Now, before we put a binding on, what I do is I actually run the edge of my presser foot against the seam we've just sewn, and with my needle in the center, and that will give me a cutting line. I'm going to stitch in a line which I'm going to trim back to, and it will be a shy 3/8 or 1 centimeter away from the edge. Making the seam slightly smaller to put our binding on means that when the pack will actually not be as bulky looking once it's turned out. So I have a second range. So I've got train lines. So I'm going to trim back to the outside right train line, and that will be clipping off our clips as we go as well. We want to trim around the whole outside edge. And then we will machine some knit binding around the seam. I would be binding this seam first and then joining the other side panel to the top edge of this gusset and then finish it in the same way. I do it in 2 sections. I won't leave all the binding till the end. I find it easier to do one and then the other. So I'm going to quickly just bind this. Well, I'm going to go into more detail on our second binding seam. So I'm just starting at the bottom, wrapping and just using a zigzag stitch. You may need to put in a denim needle or something. May even need to put in a knit needle depending on how your machine reacts with the knit binding, because zigzag is not zigzag on a knit that's going through bolts, and there is not always the easiest thing for a machine to do, but it can be done as long as you've got the right needle. Let's attach our strap so it's wrong side up, finding the center, and we need to just machine sew this onto our seam allowance. Okay, once that's sewn on, we want to actually attach our last panel. marking centre on centre, same as we did with the other one. Join it all together. Snip that seam every 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch. Just around the curved areas, attach them with quilt clips, and then sew that seam. So we'll have the binding seam up on our machine when we're doing this. Okay, so that machine is sewn, and you can see that I have got some train tracks. I've re-sewn that seam. It's a little bit harder when you've got that top binding on. So I want to actually start this, and I'm starting it from just before my center notch, and I'm going around the edge. And I'm slightly pulling the knit binding as I'm stitching. Slightly pulling it. It doesn't matter, it's not going to draw the seam up, the seam's too strong, so but the knit binding just needs to be slightly pulled so it makes a nice crease against the edge. If it's not totally even, it doesn't matter, you're not going to see inside the bag. If you want to hand sew this into place, by all means do, but it's really not necessary. The factories that make bags and backpacks and duffel bags, etc., they have machines that add binding like this, like an upholstery machine that finishes the ends of carpets and what have you. So it actually turns the binding into a cone like foot, and it just applies it beautifully and quick. But this is not bad. I'm just using a plain straight stitching foot. So I'm going to sew for about a good inch past where I started, and because it's knit, I'm just going to trim it off. I don't have to fold the edge under. It's not going to fray, it's not going to go anywhere, you're not going to see it. Right, the bag is quite strong, so you need to actually, I won't say you need to wrangle it, but you need to turn it through firmly but gently. It's coming through the zip area. So birthing the bag it's you got to be a bit forceful. Probably going to stop and take a quick pic because I'm not going to do it twice. Yep, there we are. Now, photo opportunity. So, push the bag out, looking good. Now, the closure for that front flap pocket, look inside. A bit dark in there. That zip opening is more than enough. You don't want it to be opening so as the bag falls apart. Now, might need a wee light press for some steam. So this strap gets thread through that tunnel on, the webbing gets thread through the tunnel on our shoulder strap. And that's what keeps that flap closed. So when you're wearing it, it has to stay up to the top and keep that closed so as you can't get into it. So it's not going to hang down when it's on your body. Let's thread on our rectangular, I'm going to say rectangular D-ring with a bar through it. It's a slider, rectangular slider. Add on our lobster clasp at the end. Then turn it over and then thread the end back onto itself, onto that bar, that slider bar. It's a bit fiddly, but easily doable. Then we just want to turn that raw edge in twice, turn it over 3/4 of an inch and turn it over another 3/4 of an inch, and we're just going to zigzag that into position as close to the bar as your machine can get. So we have a choice, whether you're left-handed or right-handed, you can actually wear the bag with the lobster clasp on either side of those D-rings. And you can see I've just zigzagged the end. Hope you enjoyed this. I enjoyed making this project for you.